Now, the other type of rejection of the divine is not really atheism. It's not a denial of God per se. It's a hatred of God. Now, why am I mentioning this in the webinar or the session when we're discussing the definition of God? Well, the reason I'm mentioning this because it's really going to inform us as well, and it links to another session when we're talking about the problem of evil and suffering. And it's going to give us more tools at our disposal to recognize and make distinctions about different types of not only atheism, but a rejection of God in some way. Now, misotheism comes from the two Greek words, misos miso, which means hatred, and theism, which comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. This means hatred of God, and this is a religious type of rebellion that's been hiding, right? It's been lurking in the dark. And I've just mentioned it doesn't reject God's existence per se, but rather they hate God and they wish that he didn't exist. Now, why is that the case? Well, they do so is because originally misotheists, those who hate God, generally speaking, are motivated by admirable humanistic impulses, meaning and especially if you see the literature of these misotheists, they came from a certain period in time where there was a lot of war and there was a lot of suffering. So one would argue it's similar to our time. So they would say, look, we're compassionate people, and we're thinking, oh my God, this suffering, this poverty, this death, this war, this human gratuitous suffering, we don't want it to happen because we feel compassion for our fellow man. And this genuine humanistic impulse made them to hate God because they thought God was the cause. They thought God was at fault. They thought there's no good reason for God not be able to stop this. Now, there's Associate Professor Bernard Schweitzer. He wrote a book on this. It's called Hating God, the Untold Story of Misotheism. And he basically concludes that even though that these misotheists had genuine humanistic impulses, they struggled with the idea that God is merciful and loving in a world full of suffering and evil. Now, we're going to discuss this in depth in one of the sessions throughout the 10 weeks. However, there's something that we should say right now. And the first thing I would say is that really, these misotheists, these people who hate God based on these reasons, have suffered from something called egocentrism. Egocentrism is the cognitive bias that basically says, my way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things. Okay? My way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things. So if I feel that it's impossible that God has any good reasons to allow evil and suffering, if I feel that my perspective tells me that there is no reconciliation between a good God and a powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world, then that is the case. And this really, although initially they had genuine humanistic impulses, it basically made them fall into the kind of spiritual and cognitive disease of egocentrism, that my way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things. And this is extremely problematic because they don't understand that Allah is maximally perfect, meaning his names and attributes are to the highest degree possible. And he is Al-Hakim, he is the wise, he is Al-Alim, he is the knowing. And his knowledge and wisdom are to the highest degree possible. Allah has the picture, we just have a pixel. They fail to understand this. And by doing so, there's a subtle form of associating partners with Allah. They've committed a form of shirk in some way, because they're saying, what are they saying? They're saying that God's wisdom and knowledge is like mine. That's what they're saying, because they're saying my way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things, right? And God can't have a reason that's better than mine or different to mine. And God can't have an excuse or some kind of, rationale, that's better than mine or different to mine. Because they made themselves on par with God from that perspective, because they failed to understand that Allah's knowledge and wisdom is greater than theirs. Bernard Schweizer, he says, and he's summarizing what we've discussed so far, he says, the situation is different for the misotheist. To him, the incompatibility of widespread evil with the image of a benevolent God, which means a good God, is a real problem, not merely a case of hair-splitting theological arguments. Misotheists are genuine accusers of God, and they will hold him accountable for random evil and undeserved suffering. Thus, atheists and misotheists come to the question of God's role in human suffering from opposed directions. The unbeliever would say that the misotheist makes an invalid claim based on fiction. To the misotheist himself, precisely because he is a believer, God is not a scapegoat, but an accomplice or an instigator of evil. Because they're basically saying that, you know, if my way of seeing this is the only way, therefore God doesn't have an excuse, therefore God is up for, God is the one who's evil himself. And this is based on egocentrism, which is a cognitive and I would argue a spiritual form of bias that basically says my way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things, which is an egocentric perspective. Now let's move to philosophical naturalism. This one you should start taking some notes in my view. It's very important, okay? Now, philosophical naturalism is a philosophy, okay? And this is not to be confused with methodological naturalism, which we're going to discuss in the session when we talk about science, religion, and revelation and God. Philosophical naturalism is a lens. It's like a first principle. It's like the lenses that someone puts on their eyes to understand the world, to make sense of the world. It's the starting point. It's not the end point. It's a first principle. It's a metaphysic. It's a philosophy. It's a way of seeing the world, a way of trying to understand the world. It's like putting lenses on their eyes. And when you put lenses on your eyes and the lenses are yellow, all you're going to see is yellow. Likewise, the philosophical naturalist, when they put philosophical naturalism on their intellectual lenses, then that's all they're going to try and understand and see. Now, philosophical naturalism is based on the following. Number one, it asserts that there is no God. They start with that position. Okay, there is no God. Number two, they say that all phenomena can be explained via physical processes. Okay, which basically means that there is no non-physical, and therefore they reject all supernatural claims. And also, philosophical naturalism would argue that there is nothing outside of the universe, and even if there was something outside, so to speak, of the universe, it doesn't interfere with it. So this is a very important understanding that we have to take into consideration, because most atheists are philosophical naturalists, but it doesn't follow that all philosophical naturalists are atheists, okay? Because philosophical naturalism entails disbelief in God. Disbelief in God does not entail philosophical naturalism. So we have to be very nuanced here. So just to summarize, philosophical naturalism is the view that there is no God, that all phenomena can be explained by physical processes, that there is no non-physical, that they reject all supernatural claims, and there's nothing outside of the universe, and if there was something outside of the universe, it doesn't interfere with it. So it's very important for us to be nuanced and to understand that not all atheists are philosophical naturalism. Now, according to Professor Richard Dawkins, atheists are philosophical naturalists. He says in his book, The God Delusion, I think it's page 14, he says that atheists believe there is nothing beyond the natural physical world, which really is the kind of summary of philosophical naturalism. However, it's very important to understand that some atheist academics are not naturalists. Although they deny the divine, they deny God for other reasons, they may affirm the existence of non-physical phenomena. And you find some of these academics, for example, in the philosophy of the mind. Like they may be panpsychists, or they may adopt a non-physicalist and non-materialistic understanding of consciousness. So this is interesting because those type of atheists who may deny God, but they are not philosophical naturalists, it's probably easier to intellectually engage with them because they don't dismiss non-physical phenomena. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind, because we don't want to label people in some kind of unjust way and say, look, yes, you are all philosophical naturalists. No, that's not the case. some are not. However, even in saying this, remember what I said earlier on? I said, generally speaking, atheists don't like labels. So if you were to say to them, hey, you're a philosophical naturalist, that creates a barrier in your discussion with them. And remember, our goal is to be committed to people's well-being, based on the hadith that I mentioned previously, that we must love for humanity what we love for ourselves. And this means that we must be committed to their goodness and committed to their guidance. Now, if you start labeling people, sometimes that puts up intellectual and emotional and psychological barriers. What you need to do is understand the concept of philosophical naturalism and see if someone's a philosophical naturalism based on your discussion. So you wouldn't just label them straight away. You'd engage in a discussion. You'd find out, okay, this person doesn't believe in God. This person believes that everything can be explained by physical processes. This person rejects supernatural, or rejects rejects the fact that there is anything non-physical. Well, therefore, they're a philosophical naturalist by definition. You don't have to label them now, but now you know what's going on here, and you know how to address it because you've seen the fact that they have affirmed the key ideas of philosophical naturalism.